who's coming to us today from California, where he lives and works at a tech startup called The Toast.
Rippling, but you were close.
Wait, I don't know why I made that. I just made that up. Sorry. Okay. Anyway, and Dan comes to us with a lot of experience in college admissions, and typically Dan has done essay writing workshops with us at Berkeley Carroll, but this year we thought we'd ask him to do something a little bit different and do a case studies program, because we want you to understand a little bit more about what it's like when colleges get applications and read them and have to make decisions. So today, essentially, you are going to be doing just that. Dan, I first met Dan, I don't know how many years ago, in Baltimore when he was working at Tufts University, where he was the senior assistant director of admission.
Whatever, I don't actually know what my title was either, so it's okay.
Yeah. Where he's also an alum and he holds a master's degree from Duke University. Dan has talked to high school students all across the country, but also all over the world. He did a lot of work with international schools in Southeast Asia and Italy, and now he is with us virtually in Brooklyn. So we really need for you to do today is pay attention. Today is a little bit interactive. We want you to get a feel for what it's like to be in the spot of an admission counselor who has to make a decision about who to admit and who to waitlist and who to deny. The other thing we're asking you to do, and also part of like paying attention, is we really want you to think about this experience and help you shape the list that you might make for yourself in the fall. But also, we want you to reflect on this in a written paragraph, which you will get more information about. So, Dan,
I didn't know about that last part.
This is school, Dan.
Yeah, it's school.
Yeah. I want you to really think about how you think, what you think about the college application process now, what you anticipate it being like in the fall, and you might change some of your ideas and opinions by the time this is all over. So I'm going to stop talking because I've rambled way too much and turn it over to Dan.
Hello, this is my very first time doing this presentation over Zoom. It's the favorite thing I get to talk about. It's actually really fun to do, and I think fun to participate in. I have no idea if it'll be fun to participate in virtually, but when we're all in a room together, it's fun to participate in. You get to argue with each other. You get to argue with me, which is kind of my favorite thing. And so I'm gonna ask like a favor of all of you, which is like, use the chat functionality, like ask questions, raise your hands if you want. Like if you want to ask the question like over audio, you can just like say in chat, like I've got a question, and I'll say like, okay, turn on your mic and let's go. It's a lot more fun for me to do this if we're like participating in this together, which I know is kind of half impossible to do over Zoom, but we'll do our best. And then there's a part towards the end, which is like explicitly interactive. And I don't mean interactive with like me, I mean interactive across you. And so your participation will be like kind of required at that point. And so when I said like, if your camera's off, I'm a lot more likely to call on you. Like that's the part of time that I'm talking about, just so you know when we get there, if you want to like leave your camera off until we get there and then turn it on so you have like a shield against being obnoxiously called upon without warning, you'll know. So I'm gonna hop into it. Let's go. And slideshow, present. Okay, so behind closed doors, that's the name of this presentation. I wrote this presentation, the skeleton for it, while I worked at Tufts University in Boston. I loved working there. I was a student there. I loved going there. If you're interested in Tufts, you should be. Good choice. But the idea behind this was that highly selective college admissions in the United States is this like black box. You spend all this time, all this effort, all this energy preparing for admissions, visiting colleges in quotes, because like you obviously haven't done that yet. And writing these essays, doing all this work in school, working on your extracurriculars to like be prepared to apply, and then you send in your applications, and some stranger who you probably will never meet and don't know, and who won't meet you and won't know your face and won't really know anything about you except that you present, then like gives you a decision back 2 weeks later or a month later or 4 months later that potentially completely transforms your life. And there's like an insanity to that, right? There's like, it's actually kind of like crazy that you spend so much time and effort and energy on something and then have absolutely no idea what happened or why. Like if you get denied by your favorite school and you call them up and you're like, hey, what happened to my application? They will give you the same song and dance they give everybody else. It's a highly selective applicant pool. We had a lot of qualified people who applied. We really respected and admired your contributions and your achievements, but we had so many people and you just didn't make it. They're not going to tell you anything that's useful. And if you get in and are admitted and you try to have like exactly the same conversation, tell me why, maybe a particularly great admissions officer will like remember you and your application well enough to give you that answer. But like actually for the most part, they're not really going to tell you anything about why you got in either. And so there's this huge thing in your life that is like important and that everyone keeps telling you is important, which is why we're spending like an hour and a half together today, right? And here you are like 6 months from application deadlines and you're already being drilled in how important this stuff is. And you have to like write a thing afterwards on what you learned about this for your future, right? And you have no idea what's happening behind closed doors or why. And so the point of this presentation is to give you insight into that. And we're going to do that by talking about 3 pieces. In the first piece, I'm going to teach you how to think like an admissions officer. What is a professional who reads your application? What are they looking at? What are they valuing? Why? Then I'm going to teach you how to understand a selective applicant pool, right? Like you know what it's like to be at Berkeley Carroll and apply to these schools, or you will. You don't know what it's like to be at a college and receive tens of thousands of applications from all around the world where you are one person in that sea of people. So I want you to see and understand what that looks like. And then in the last part, I'm going to show you what it's like to make decisions by presenting applications to you the same way they would have been presented in the admissions committees that I used to be a part of, and by asking you to select who you want to let into a fake school that I invented for the purpose of this exercise called Thoreau University, and why. So we're going to start with that first part. How do you think like an admissions officer? And again, please put questions in the chat. It will make this so much more interesting for me if you actually have questions. Play from current slide. Merit is comprised of basically 4 pieces. There's your academic achievement. How successful have you been in school or on standardized tests for the schools that require them? Your extracurricular engagement. What do you do outside the classroom that that demonstrates your capacity to be successful, but that also has allowed you to grow, learn, achieve, diversify your own interests, diversify your own thinking, your personal qualities, which is like, who are you? What's your perspective? What do you bring to a conversation? What do you bring to a community that isn't about what you do? It's about how you see. And then the last form of merit, which is in yellow, while the others are in shades of blue, are institutional priorities. These are the things that the universities and colleges value that has nothing to do with you. So we want more people to study Russian for our Russian department, right? That's an institutional priority that has nothing to do with you. If you're a Russian major, it helps you, but it's a thing that they set. You usually don't know about or can't directly influence, but it's a huge part of who gets in. I'm being too loud. Somebody just closed my door. It's a huge part of who gets in and why. And so these are the 4 things that comprise merit. And what you'll notice here, particularly around institutional priorities, is like some of these are about things you do and some of these are about things the universities want. And so merit, because I'm teaching you to think like an admissions officer, merit is about what the universities value, not whether you as a person have merit, not whether you as a student have merit. It's what is merit to them. We're going to go through each of those 4 with a little more detail. So the first one, merit academic achievement. Every applicant who applies to every school gets reviewed academically. An admissions officer looks at these 3 things in this order with this level of relative importance, from most important to least important, generally. Curricular rigor. How hard are the classes you have chosen to take given what's available to you at your high school? So rigor is assessed within your local environment and your local community. Every school has a different set of options, and every student then has a different set of opportunities to be rigorous. And so rigor is assessed given the opportunities you have available to you at Berkeley Carroll. Then your grades, how successful have you been in those classes? with a particular focus on the more recent work that you've done, because it's more reflective of who you are today than the work you would have done as a first year or freshman in high school. Not that those grades don't count or aren't important, but they're less important than success at the end, because success at the end is a reflection of who you are today. Success at the beginning is a reflection of who you were at the beginning. You'll notice rigor comes before grades. That's because it's very hard to know what your grades mean unless somebody knows how hard your classes have been. And then the final form of merit for academic achievement is standardized testing for the schools that require it. I'm thrilled that fewer schools require it than they used to. I think the SATs are a really fantastic aggregate measure of academic achievement and a really poor individual measure of academic achievement. And it's nice to see so many universities and colleges like learning that firsthand as a result of COVID. But for the schools that require it, it is really important. And you do need to be able to check all three of these boxes in order to get in. With that said, even academic achievement has a fair amount of art that goes along with the science. Like the numbers don't mean the same thing for all students, right? And so your local context is really important to understanding your local academic achievement. So your curriculum, right? That's local context. We talked about that. That's obvious. But there are other things that are less obvious, but really important, right? So even something as basic as a standardized test score like the SAT does not mean the same thing across all students. Not all 700s or 650s are created equal. If you've got a student who grew up in suburban Connecticut, who attends a local American high school whose parents are both lawyers, and that student has a 650 on the English, the critical reasoning section of the SAT. And then you've got a student in like Vietnam, so I'll go to the far other end of the example, who attends a local Vietnamese school where Vietnamese is the language of instruction, whose parents are like non-college educated Vietnamese people who don't speak English, right? And you have somebody who taught themselves English using books from the library and movies on television and 1 hour of English language instruction every day in school, and that student also has a 650, then you can have two students with the exact same number, a student in Connecticut and a student in Vietnam. They both have a 650 on the critical reasoning, the English section of the SAT, but that student in Vietnam like crushed the kid in Connecticut. If you can score a 650 with that background, that is way more impressive than a 650 coming out of the local environment in Connecticut. And so even things like that get factored into how you are assessed and how your academic achievement is understood. Every student, however, gets put on some scale that an individual school used. Where I worked at the time that I worked there, our scale was 1 to 7. 1 was the best, 7 was the worst. But I know of schools that have used 20-point scales or a 42-point scale or 10-point scales. Some admissions officer has to take your varied context, your academic achievement on all these different measures and give you like a number that represents your relative strength in their applicant pool. And for every single student who gets reviewed more thoroughly, that student must be able to demonstrate that they are capable of doing the work, that they can come to that school and graduate on time without failing their classes. For almost all of you, I assume 99% of you at 99% of the schools that you could apply to, you will be able to demonstrate that you can do the work. Like Berkeley Carroll is not an easy place academically. It's a rigorous school. Your teachers have high expectations. If you can pass your classes at Berkeley Carroll, the vast, vast majority of colleges in the United States will assume you can pass your classes there too. The next form of academic achievement is extracurricular achievement. So what have you done outside the classroom that demonstrates success, that demonstrates learning, that demonstrates growth? Some of what's being assessed here is really obvious and straightforward. It's like what you would do if you were looking at a resume. Have you particular depth or particular achievement, awards, victories, leadership, whatever, in a specific area? What kind of impact are you making on your community and how? And then there's stuff that they're assessing that is less obvious. So this is what they're reading between the lines. What can they learn about who you are as a person and who you are as a thinker from looking at what you've chosen to do? There are people who like to explore. I'm one of them. Like, I don't think I stuck with anything in high school for more than 2 years because I get bored and I want to learn the next thing. And there are other people who find a love and stick with it. That wasn't me. And that's not necessarily better or worse, but they're different and they lead to different kinds of achievement and different kinds of contexts. There are people who specialize, right? Like they love music and all they do is music. And there are other people who are well-rounded and they do a bunch of different things. And you can be an explorer who specializes, right? Like you can be a musician who's picking up your sixth instrument in 5 years and have deep, deep specialization in music while still exploring within that specialty. And the reason that this is important is because they're trying to get a sense not just of what you've already done, but what you might be doing in the future. And so these non-obvious things help point towards the kind of mind you're going to be, not just outside the classroom, but in the classroom as well, and the kinds of issues you're going to be drawn towards and the kinds of things that you'll be interested in. And then there are personal qualities. This is the last form of merit that is a reflection of you, which is who are you as a person? What do you bring, not by doing something, but just by showing up? And you'll notice that intellectual curiosity is the first in the major headings here, and that it is listed separately from academic achievement. And that's because you can be deeply curious and still have terrible grades, and you can have great grades and not be curious at all. Um, One of the things I've actually found frustrating about high school, I assume this is not the case at Berkeley Carroll, but who knows? I didn't go to Berkeley Carroll. One of the things I found frustrating in high school is that like sometimes asking the good questions got you worse grades because you were curious about things that weren't the assignment. And I'd like run off and learn about something that I thought was interesting that was sort of like related to the assignment. And then I'd turn in a paper and my teachers would hand it back to me and be like, B, you didn't actually answer the question I asked. And I was like, well, your question was boring. I like went out and found a more interesting question and tried to answer that. And so academic achievement is really important, but our professors, like if you sit down with a professor in a college and you're like, what kinds of students do you want in your classroom? They don't say, I want students who got A's in high school. They say, I want students who ask good questions, right? And the capacity to get an A is a different thing than the capacity to ask a good question. And so curiosity is being assessed as a specific quality that you demonstrate through your application. There are demographics and diversity. You create a more interesting conversation around any issue if people have different perspectives and different points of view. The value of diversity is not just to like check a box, it's because you want disagreement in a classroom, and whether we like it or not, demographics are a really important part of how each of us sees the world. My gender, my race, my socioeconomic background, my religious foundation, the passport I carry, all these things contribute to how I see the world, to what I notice in it, what I want to talk about, and what I think is important. And if I'm around people who have differences, who can talk about what they see as important, then I learn things that are impossible to learn if I'm only around people like me. And since these colleges are trying to create the best possible learning environment they can, they need to create the most diverse learning environment they can. Not all of them are particularly good at that, but that is a goal and it's really important. And then things like interpersonal skills, like are you charismatic? Are you nice? Do people like working with you? You know, charismatic high school students become charismatic college students, become charismatic college alums, become highly paid professionals, become donors. So if a college wants a strong donor class, you know, charismatic people who go on to be successful in the workplace, that's like a valuable thing to look for. And so the question that's being asked here is like, what are you adding to the campus community beyond just sitting in a seat in a classroom? They learn about your personal qualities in particular by asking you to write essays. I assume you know that they're going to ask you to write essays. These are 3 of the 7 prompts for the common application for the coming year. Some students have a background, identity, interest, talent that is so meaningful they believe their application would be incomplete without it. If this sounds like you, please share your story. Or discuss an accomplishment, event, or realization that sparked a period of personal growth and a new understanding of yourself or others. And then of course, like question number 7 every year is basically like write whatever you want. Like we don't care, just pick a topic. Like so they give you 6 options, and then the 7th option is whatever you want to say is fine. Um, I think that this is like paralyzing for a lot of students because being told that you can write about anything doesn't necessarily give you a clear direction. But I think just as important to understand is that no one likes these questions. These are terrible questions. You know, is anybody really like, God, discuss an accomplishment, event, or realization that sparked a period of personal growth and a new understanding of myself and others? I cannot wait to talk about that. Thank God you asked. Um, but the reason that these questions get asked is because there are hundreds of member institutions for the Common Application, and they have to agree on the set of questions. And if you ask several hundred people to come to a consensus on anything, you're going to end up in like a very safe middle place, which is what these questions are. These are very safe middle ground questions. And if you ask a boring question, you tend to get a boring answer. And so a lot of students really struggle to take these questions and do something interesting with them because the questions themselves are not interesting. And so the advice I'd have for you here, you're not asking for advice yet, but I'm going to give it to you, is find a way to frame this question such that you are actually excited about answering it. Like if you are answering a question where you are bored by the prompt, then you will be bored by what you write. And so you have to find a way to take that and turn it into something interesting. But because a lot of students don't know how to do that or don't feel they have permission to, or don't have someone like me saying, like, go ahead and ask yourself a different, more interesting question, a lot of colleges have started managing part of this concern by asking supplemental questions, right? The hope of like getting you to say something just with like a little more texture and a little more teeth than what the common application does. And so here are 3 such examples from Occidental, the University of Chicago, and Pitzer College. I'll read 2 of them. University of Chicago, do you feel lucky? Well, do you, punk? Eleanor Roosevelt, right? So they're saying that like this quote from Dirty Harry was said by Eleanor Roosevelt, and the prompt is misattribute a famous quote and explore the implications of doing so. It's kind of a ridiculous question. And then Occidental College, which Occidental has as part of their mission statement, diversity amidst community. And so they ask this question, what do you value in a community and how do you see your perspective and life experiences enhancing it, right? There are 2 things I think are important to take away from this. The first is like they're trying to get you to talk about something specific because they want you to talk about something with like a little more teeth to it than the Common App, but also they are revealing something about themselves in what they choose to ask. The University of Chicago has this reputation for being this like eccentric intellectual place that doesn't always care about whether an idea can be used so much as like whether the idea is interesting. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's the reputation of the school. And so they asked this question, right? That like has no real use in the world. Like, what are you going to say here that's like actually functional in the world? They just like want you to be smart and interesting for the sake of being smart and interesting. And then Occidental College, which has this really strong value around community and life experience and perspective that then asks a question explicitly in their application that says like, talk to us about those things because this is what we value. And so for the schools that choose to ask supplements that are about things like this, they are telling you, they are giving you the answer to what is important to them and saying, here's your opportunity to talk about it. And then you have to reflect what's important to you to them. The other kind of supplemental essay that a lot of schools ask is the why us question. So, you know, in Dartmouth in 100 words, Earlham College in Indiana in 200 words, the university, oh, that says Penn, it's supposed to be Kalamazoo in the Midwest, Minnesota, Kalamazoo's in Minnesota. Did I get that right? Anybody know? Ooh, look at that.
Michigan.
Michigan, one of the mem states. I've only lived on the coasts that, um, they're asking like, tell us why you want to come here. And they ask this question because they want to know why do you want to come there, and because they want to know that you've like put some effort into researching their schools and that you have an understanding of them. The easy way to answer this question is to just like go on their websites, find a couple facts, and like put those facts into the answer to this question. But of course, the easy way is like not what gets you into Dartmouth. Or for that matter to Kalamazoo. And so if all you do is go on their websites and you just like find some things and like put it in an essay, they're gonna know because it's obvious that you went on a website, found some things and put it in an essay. And so the better way to approach these questions is to ask yourself, like, what is it about this school that resonates with me? And why is this place important to me? Relatively speaking, they're not all going to be the most important. And then put that in the essay where you use the things you find on the website as like evidence for a deeper set of qualities that you want to talk about. But these questions are really important. Schools sacrifice. I mean, they make a real sacrifice by asking this question. Colgate, not Colgate, Colby College, I don't know, like 7-8 years ago now, dropped the supplement from their application, and in 1 year saw a 42% increase in applications just by dropping the supplement. Like, these schools in a real way are sacrificing volume. They are sacrificing applicants to ask these questions. They are giving something precious up in the form of volume and admit rate to get this information out of you. And so you have to take these essays seriously. while the common application essay may be the most important essay you write because it goes to everyone, for the schools that ask a supplemental essay question like this one, right? Pitzer College, like when Pitzer asks this question, your answer to this question will be more important to Pitzer than your common application essay will, because they sacrifice something to ask it. So recommendations are the other place where schools learn about your personal qualities. Teacher recommendations, teachers are supposed to talk about you within the context of a classroom setting. So who are you within the micro of a class? Counselors are supposed to talk about you within the macro of the school. Who are you in the school as a whole? Um, you really want to know your teachers in order to get good recs, but I know that this year has been a complicated one for building those relationships. Um, make an effort, in the last weeks of the school year for the teachers who you think you might want to have write your reference letters, to make sure that they like understand things about you that are important to how you performed in their class and why you were engaged in the subject material. Institutional priorities are the things that they say and that you don't control. So here are some examples of institutional priorities. The dean of the engineering school wants gender balance. They want to get to 50-50 female, male in the School of Engineering, a thing that is almost impossible to do, sadly, for just about every school in the country. But this is an institutional priority they have. And so if you are a solid female engineering candidate who maybe doesn't have as much extracurricular engagement, they may say, that's okay, because you have merit in a different way. You help us get to something that we believe is socially and sociologically important, which is creating gender balance in STEM. Or, I worked at a school where I worked, our football team lost every single game for 3 consecutive seasons. It was really embarrassing. I mean, if you care about football, I don't care about football. It didn't embarrass me. But we have alums from like the 70s and 80s who remember like the glory days of Tufts football. Maybe the glory days are back. I don't know. I don't really pay attention to whether or not my school is like good at football now, but they weren't then. And so these alums were like really angry, and they were actually writing these like really nasty, angry letters to the director of athletics and to the president of the university about what a like national embarrassment it was that our like Division III NESCAC football team wasn't winning more games. I think national embarrassment is strong in that context. But there was like all this pressure that our AD was under, our athletics director, and that our dean of admissions was under to like secure a win for the football team. And so if we had a student who applied who was like the best quarterback prospect that we had ever seen, right? Like that student could have pretty mediocre grades and pretty mediocre everything else, and we would still admit him because his ability to win us that one football game that gets a decade's worth of alums to like crawl out from the president's inbox, that's merit to my institution. And I think it's like ridiculous merit, but it is merit in the way that colleges think about merit, right? And so if the next year you're a quarterback who is slightly better, but we successfully recruited that quarterback, and now we've won that one game that we needed to win so that the alums would stop being so angry. Like, you may be a better quarterback than the year before, but you have less merit to the institution this year than that person did last year. And so this is like a really fuzzy and complicated thing to wrap your brains around, and you don't need to be aware of it. Like, you shouldn't be trying to think like, what's the institutional priority I can lock myself into? Because like, you're not going to know. Like, colleges are not going to come around and be like, by the way, if you happen to be a good football player, this is the year we really need you. Other years, who cares? This year, we need you. Like, they're not going to do that. But it will help you understand when you see admissions results around you or in the grade that just got their results, like in the last couple months. Like, it'll help you understand, like, when something looks weird or seems strange, there's probably something like this going on behind the scenes, right? And so, like, donors are a really good example of institutional priorities. If at schools that care about this, every school sets their own. But if like you're the grandchild of somebody who donated $15 million to the financial aid budget of the schools where I work, and now I can go to like urban Baltimore and Detroit and rural West Virginia and Nepal and and Rwanda, and like I can recruit students from places where we never would have been able to get them if they needed to afford their own cost of education, but we can like provide them the financial backing they need to come to our institution, to provide diversity, to bring international backgrounds or domestic backgrounds that are hard to come by otherwise, or a perspective or a set of experiences that are really difficult to replicate, or maybe they're just like really, really good at the thing they want to study, but they're poor, right? And our ability to admit them is contingent on whether or not your grandfather gave us $15 million 25 years ago. Like that's merit to the place where I work. You don't have to like it. You can think it's gross. It is gross, but it's also like real. And you should know what happens. Do anyone have questions about the forms of merit before I start talking about selective applicant pools? How do I see the chat window if I'm in the presenter view? Can I do that? Zoom is so complicated. I should know better. Clea, can I just like deputize you if somebody puts something in the chat, because I actually can't see it while I'm in presenter. Can you like unmute and just be like, there's a question for you?
Yes, and there's no question so far, but there is a statement from Sophia that this whole system seems messed up, which we agree.
I mean, I don't disagree, but also like it's reality. So it is messed up. That things like legacy and your father's capacity or grandmother's capacity to like donate a bunch of money impacts on like the opportunities you have in your life. But if you're like a pragmatic, hard-nosed dean at a private university or college, and most of the deans at those places are idealistic, but also very hard-nosed and very pragmatic, like you need the money in order to achieve the social justice outcomes you're trying to achieve. Like in order to get to the place that is more ideal, you need the dollars. And so there's this like constant tension in admissions. Like my old dean, who's now the dean at Dartmouth, who's just like an incredible leader, um, he used to say in our staff meetings, like the work of an admissions office is figuring out how to get as close as you can to the ideal while also balancing the needs of the practical. And there's truth to that, both like at the leadership level, but also as an individual level, as someone who's reading the applications and you're like looking at somebody and thinking like, this isn't ideal, but it's what's practical. And part of my job is to do what's practical in order to grant me the license to do the things that are ideal. I'm assuming some of you are hearing this and being like, this sounds like someone trying to like BS justify a set of things they do that are gross. And I totally understand why some of you might feel that way, but when you're doing the job, there's no other option. So we're going to move into talking about a highly selective applicant pool. By the way, that was a great comment. Thank you for making it, and please feel free to make more. I invented a university to do this. Thoreau University does not exist. It isn't real, but it is, like real universities, named after an old dead white guy. Thoreau is ranked 19th at US News and World Report. We have about 6,500 total undergraduates. We receive a little more than 30,000 applications. We admit about 13% of those applications. And you can see some other stats here, including our like cost and annual budget for financial aid. This is like, Thoreau doesn't exist, but it's also, Thoreau is modeled very closely off of actual universities that do exist. And so when I start talking about the numbers that Thoreau sees, this does reflect like a reality that's out there, particularly at the most selective range. So the applicant pool at Thoreau, this is what our admitted students tend to look like. They tend to be in the top 10% of their graduating class at the schools that rank. It's incredibly uncommon for private schools to rank at all. And so these students who get captured in that top 10% number, almost all, like 99.9% of them, come from public schools that offer class rank. So this number is very misleading if you're not at a school that ranks in this way. But it's a number that gets reported, so it's here, and this is Thoreau's. And this is the average SAT score for an admit at Thoreau. This is the middle 50% band. So 25% of the students that we admit are below that bottom number, 25% are above the top number. And here's how Thoreau compares to a group of places that do exist. And what you'll notice is there's like a lot of uniformity. Like these numbers are very similar at all these schools. Like once you get to the point that Thoreau is at, academically, the students that these colleges are admitting are like basically all the same.
Dan, quick
Here,
question. Do you
yeah.
have a sense of what Thoreau's ACT score range might be?
Yeah, so I'm doing this on the SAT just because like otherwise it's too much numbers and it overwhelms you. But you can think of this as like a 31 to 30, yeah, a 3130 to 3334.
Thank you.
So keep calling me out on that. So this is like what our academic scale looks like. I mentioned when I was talking about the academic slides, every student gets put onto a scale. Thoreau's scale is 1 to 9. 1 is the best, 9 is the worst. And an admissions officer has to take your academic achievement and sort of like figure out what number best encapsulates where you are. Rigor is, again, within the context of your high school, how demanding was your curriculum, grades. Thoreau doesn't recalculate GPA, but since every school has a different GPA scale, just to make this sane, I have this as a 4 point, on a 4 point scale. 4 would be straight A's, 3.5 would be half A's, half B's, a 3 would be straight B's, basically. Class rank P would be class rank at a public school. Class rank I would be class rank at an independent school. Almost no independent school actually tells us the class rank, but often, if you've read enough applications and you're familiar enough with the independent school, you can make a pretty good guess about like what the rank of that student is within the context of the school. And so that's what that number reflects. And then testing, this would be like 35, 36, 34, 33, 32, 31, and so on, broadly speaking. Click. So a good way to think about this is, when you're thinking about your college list, you're finding reach schools, you're finding target schools, and you're finding foundation. Is that the word you guys like?
Yes.
Foundation schools? Foundation schools. Um, the way to think about that is that those three groups are the opposite of these three groups. So schools that are safe for you are schools where you would apply and be academically outstanding. You would be stronger than the typical admit they make. Target schools are schools you could apply to where you would be competitive. You would look like a typical admit. Schools that you would apply to that are, or sorry, not safe, foundational. Schools that you would apply to as reach schools are schools where you're viable. You know you can do the work. They could admit you and you would go there and be successful in their classes. But academically, your numbers are at least half a step below, not even a full step, just half a step below what they typically admit. And so these are the categories from like the perspective of the university, right? Like stronger students are outstanding, typical students are competitive, below competitive students who could be admitted are viable, and then below that are a group of students who need context, where based on their academics, you're not sure if they could come and graduate successfully on time. And so you need some additional piece of information, some context about the student or their background that would allow you to like revisit the meaning of their grades or their scores in order to bump them into the viable group. Here's how these four categories map onto the scale at Thoreau. 1s and 2s are considered academically outstanding. 3s and 4s are considered academically competitive. 5s, 6s, and 7s are considered viable. 8s and 9s cannot be admitted unless there's some unusual context in their application that makes you think that their grades are better than they appear to be. Does anyone have questions about this? It's like I went through that a little fast. It's a little complicated. And this is how these groups break down into the applicant pool at Thoreau. So students who are academically outstanding, so 1s and 2s, 1s and 2s represent a little bit less than 15% of the applicant pool. 3s and 4s represent about half of the applicant pool. 5s, 6s, and 7s are a little less than a third of the applicant pool, and 8s and 9s, who are the group that you can deny based on just academics, are less than 10%. This is pretty normal for schools like Thoreau. As you move down the selectivity ladder, so as you like go to schools that have admit rates that are more like 20% or 25% or 30%, what will start to happen is these numbers will start to look more like 30, 30, 30, 10. As you go up the selectivity ladder and are talking about schools with like 3% admit rates or 5% admit rates, who I won't name, but you probably are aware of, like this number drops to 0 and everybody goes into the competitive bucket. If you're a school with a 5% admit rate, there is no such thing as an academically outstanding student. It is impossible to be stronger than a typical admit because the admits that they're making are already at the top of that scale. So what you can see here is more than 60% of our applicants are outstanding and competitive, but we only admit 13%. And so what this means is that we are denying a large number of students in the outstanding and competitive range. And there's a direct correlation between how strong you are academically and your overall admit rate. So for instance, the strongest academic rating is a 43% admit rate. So academic ones, if you fall in the academic one group, which means you have perfect straight A's and you have perfect SAT or ACT scores, basically. If you have perfect academics, the admit rate to Thoreau is 43%. If you are in the 7 group, your admit rate to Thoreau is 3%. So how strong you are helps you. But we are still saying no at Thoreau to 1 out of every 2 students who are academically perfect. And I want to be able to explain why. And so that's where we move into the next part, which is the part where we're going to be talking about actual fake applicants. Actual fake applicants. That's got to be the most fun thing I'm going to say today.
There's a question in the chat.
Oh yeah, go for it.
What if in these types of rankings, someone's test score is outstanding, but GPA is competitive or vice versa? Also for the other categories.
Oh, that's a great question. So you kind of have to just like feel it out. I mean, I know that's like a terrible answer, but that's what you do as a admissions officer. You like look at this and you're like, okay, most demanding curriculum grade, like, so let's say the curriculum is like a 2, the grades are like a 4, the test scores are a 1, right? Like, what do I think that means? And so if I'm talking about a student who comes from a super affluent background, who I suspect has probably had like a lot of test prep because their family can afford it, like that might be a 3. If I'm looking at a student who's coming out of an under-resourced school or from a family background, or like, let's say their parents are immigrants and so like just don't understand that much about US college admissions context, or they're first generation to college themselves, like I might say to that same student as a 2, right? So there's like a little bit of like art to look at the pieces, where do they seem to fall, and then like what might their background tell me about what this performance means in context. It's also why like grades can't just be used straight up, because like different schools will have different grade inflation. So there are schools on Long Island, for instance, where like half their graduating class has a GPA above 100 on a 100-point scale. These are like actual schools that really exist. So they're like the GPA scale, they'll give you the GPA out of 100 points, and half the class is like 100 or better. And so if you're at a place like Thoreau and you see a student who's like got straight A minuses, which on this scale would be like a 3.66, like out of that school, that straight A minus average might look more like a 6 or a 7. I don't know who asked that question, but hopefully that feels like a good answer. Thank you for asking. I really appreciate it. I wish the format allowed me to see your face and thank you, but I'll just have to namelessly. Who was it, Clea? Who did it? Who can I thank?
You can thank Anya.
Anya, thank you so much. Oh my goodness. What a great partner. Thank you for being here. So now we're going to move into making decisions. We're going to do our mock admissions. So in this, I'm going to start presenting actual applications to you. I really have to figure out how to see the chat window while also presenting. So I'm going to present 6 applications to you. Nope, that's no good. I'm going to present 6 applications to you, and I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that in 3 rounds. So in the first round, I'm going to show you their academics and only their academics. So you're just going to see GPA and some standardized test scores. In the second round, I'm going to show you their extracurricular activities alongside their academics. In the third round, I'm going to talk about what they discussed in their essays, what their teachers and counselors said about them in their recommendations, and I'm going to give you extracurriculars and academics. And you're going to vote in each round for the 2 candidates you like the most. And you can change your vote in each round. And so the idea here is you'll see how the pieces layer on top of each other so that you can get a sense of who these people are and why the pieces are important to that sense of who they are. Yeah, I'm really excited about this. This is really fun to do. I made some adjustments in this to keep it simpler. So like I've recalculated all their GPAs to be on a 4-point scale, even though the actual schools that these students come from, most of them in fact would not be on a 4-point scale. We're going to be only talking about academic 3s and 4s, so students who are in the competitive range at Thoreau, and they all have similar levels of like curricular rigor, which again, none of those things would necessarily be true in an actual admissions committee, but we got to keep this like manageable somehow. And so I've made those assumptions and are now passing them on to you. But we're going to be presenting them. I'm going to be reading them out in the same way they would be read in the admissions committees at the places where I worked, so that you can get a sense of what it's like to be in the room voting yes or no on high school students whose applications you have not read. Because most of the people who will vote yes or no on your application did not actually read your application. They are hearing about your application from someone who read it. And so that process of like, how does an application get distilled? And then how does that distillation result in a decision? That's what I want you to take out of this. So round 1, academics, I'm going to be presenting grades and SAT scores. As I mentioned, the GPAs are on a 4-point scale so that you can compare them, and they have similar levels of curricular rigor, again, so you can compare them. Here are our 6 candidates: David, Cassie, Betty, Ed, Ashley, and Frank.
Dan Weezy has a question.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, just quickly, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you great. Thanks for piping in with your voice.
Yeah, sure. I was just wondering, what are some of like the core values that Thoreau has as a school? So based on like a student as a whole, we can more accurately choose if they'd be a good fit for that school specifically.
Oh my God, I love that. That's a great question for round 3. We're not quite there yet. But I'll just say Thoreau, because it's a composite institution, right? It's actually, there are 4 specific schools I drew from to create Thoreau and its statistics. Because it's a composite institution, it's like a really average middle of a road place that doesn't have any specific character or quality you need to look for. Thoreau does have institutional priorities, which we'll talk about when we're in round 3. And so you'll get a sense of like what those priorities are and can make adjustments to how you want to vote. But you can just like, when you go and you like hear a college admissions officer talk and they present their school and you're like, that was exactly the same presentation as every other school I've sat through, which I'm sure is an experience that you've had. I'm sorry, who was the one who asked that question? What was your name again? I forgot.
Wheezy.
Wheezy. So Wheezy, if you've sat in on any of these presentations, a lot of them are just like really generic. That's Thoreau, really generic. Chat. Yes, I figured out how to get the chat up. You guys can't see the chat, right? Only I can see that chat window. That's not
Yeah,
nearby.
just you.
Cool. Okay, so I can now see your chats. That's fantastic. I figured it out. I'm so excited. Okay, so I want you to take 30 seconds, maybe less, figure out who you're going to vote for, and then we're going to vote. How are we going to vote, Clea? What are we going to do, Miss Williams? How does voting work?
Just drop it in the chat.
Drop it in the chat. Okay. As you come to your decision, put the 2 names you want to vote for in the chat. If you have questions about this, ask. I'm happy to clarify if something doesn't seem obvious. Oh, and again, Ms. Williams, your point about the ACT. I put the SAT up here because I often do this presentation for overseas communities. Like I do it in places like Korea and Singapore, Italy. And in those communities, people have much less familiarity with the ACT than the SAT. And so I use the SAT for interpretability with that group. But the actual colleges, when they require testing, really genuinely do not care. ACT, SAT, whatever, they don't care. And so you could just as easily swap out these SAT numbers for similar ACT numbers and it would be exactly the same meaning.
So pick your 2. Let's drop them in the chat when you have your 2, and maybe I'll see if I can find an easier way for that voting.
Mm-hmm. I know I've seen other people do it. You'd think after like a year of COVID, I'd have some experience with doing this, but no. Cassie, Frank, Frank, Ashley, Ashley, Ed, Frank, Cassie. Frank, Ashley. All right, so we're starting to see it's like Frank and Cassie, with like Ashley seemingly as sort of the next runner-up. But Chloe says Ashley and Frank instead of Cassie. Thanks, Miguel, for representing more than one person in this. So, I went ahead one slide too early. So this is like reasonably straightforward. You can see there aren't many data points, so it's not that hard to come to a decision. I think almost everybody had a Frank. No, there was one Ashley and Ed. What I find really interesting about doing this is like here I am presenting you with just 3 data points for each candidate: GPA, SAT-CR, which is the English section basically, SAT-M, which is math. And even here with just 3 data points, we don't have true consensus. Like there's a very clear, there are very clear winners to the voting. Like, so like Frank and followed by Cassie and then I think Ashley and then probably David after that. But even here with just these pieces of information, like you don't always agree. And so there is a human element that's like being factored in to just assessing like which numbers are better numbers. And I want to point that out because I think it's like valuable to see early. So we're going to move into the extracurricular round. Here's what I'm asking you to look for as we talk about their extracurriculars. I'm asking you to look for talent, leadership, community impact, levels of involvement, engagement. So, how strong is the resume you're being presented with? But then I also want you to like start to try to make guesses, not just about like what you're seeing, but about the person behind what you're seeing. Who do you believe them to be, and what do you believe them to be good at? And what does that tell you about whether you want them at Thoreau? So here are our 6 candidates. I'm going to read them because that's what we would do in actual committee. David started a philosophy discussion group at school. He's the president of debate team, mock trial. He runs varsity cross country, and he's a 2-year member of his school's programming club. Cassie has a joiner's profile, consistent involvement in local community service organizations, church youth group. She plays viola. She's a few years of junior varsity volleyball and 1 year of performing as an ensemble cast member in the school musical. Betty is the Honor Society president. She started a fundraiser for a natural disaster relief group, or for natural disaster relief. She won an award for that. She's the Cancer Club president. She did a summer internship for Tibetan women's group. She did that in India. She's on the varsity basketball team. She's a bus monitor 10 hours a week for the last 2 years. This is like at her school, the bus monitors are high school students who ride the bus with elementary school students to like make sure things are okay. And she writes a column about the Tibetan exile community in the Huffington Post, which she's done since March of last year. Don't get too excited about the Huffington Post. Like almost anybody can write in the Huffington Post. It's not very hard, but it's interesting she does it. Ed is a Boy Scout. He's been doing that for 4 years. He also plays piano and drums for 4 years. He's in the jazz ensemble at his school. He's got a few years of varsity wrestling. He sits on the school's disciplinary board. That's a board of students and faculty that decide school disciplinary cases together. To be on the disciplinary board, you have to be nominated by faculty members. So it's not just commentary that like he does it, it says something about how the faculty view him. Ed volunteers teaching science to elementary school students as well. Ashley has done 2 summer service trips, both abroad. She's played light piano all 4 years. Light piano means like an hour or 2 a week. She's on the swim team in 9 and 10, international club just 1 hour a week in 11 and 12, other scattered service programs that rarely last more than a few weeks. Frank is a member of his school's math team. They won first place this year. It was only a 5-hour-a-week commitment and for just 3 weeks of the year. He's done a year of autism volunteering. He played violin until junior year, but it was a big commitment and he stopped. Big commitment before junior year. So big commitment in this case is probably like 10 hours plus each week. So there are a couple things I want you to note here before we start talking about them individually. The first is 4 years of high school resume is being distilled into this. Like this is actually authentically what it would sound like in committee to hear someone's extracurricular profile read out loud. Philosophy discussion group at school, president, debate, mock trial, varsity cross country team, 2-year member of the programming club. Some admissions officer took your 4-year resume and turned it into those 2 lines. The other thing I want you to note is that this is not just factual. It's not just like a summary of the facts that you present in your extracurricular profile. Admissions officers are making comments that are designed to give flavor. So, oh, come on, computer. Cassie's got a joiner's profile, right? Like Cassie didn't write that in her extracurricular resume. She didn't like joiner's profile at the top. This is admissions officer shorthand for a student who isn't a leader in anything, but has a bunch of different consistent involvements that last for several years at more than just a couple hours a week. So she's involved in lots of different things, but nothing stands out, right? Like the same thing is true for Ashley. Other scattered service programs that rarely last more than a few weeks. Ashley did not write in her extracurricular profile, I also do scattered service programs that rarely last more than a few weeks. Like that's an admissions officer who looked at like on the Common App, there's like a section you can fill out that has like your extracurricular 1, 2, 3, 4. So Ashley like got past extracurricular 4 and just started like listing 3 or 4 different things that only lasted a couple weeks each as their own bullets. And some admissions officer read that and was like, I'm not giving each of those things time. I'm rolling them all up into scattered service programs that rarely last more than a few weeks. So the idea here is not only are you getting a sense of like how admissions officers are making decisions, but I want you to get a sense of like what they will take from your profile and then present at the committee. So as promised, you get to have extracurriculars and academics together. And now we are going to take a moment, figure out who you want to vote for, and start putting round 2 votes into the chat. Betty Frank, Betty Ed, Betty and Ed, Frank and Betty. People like Frank still. Betty and Ed. Dylan says Betty and Frank. Augie. I know an Augie who also only spells her name with 1 G. Betty and Frank.
Is
Betty and Ed. So we're seeing a lot of Betty and kind of a split between Frank and Ed. The vote I saw in round 1 for David. Oh, there's a David in there. Wheezy says Ed and David. Let's Carly Saba. Am I pronouncing your last name correctly?
It's Saba.
Saba, Carly Saba. You've got a Cassie in here. Nobody else has a Cassie in here. What did you see in Cassie? Why did you give her the vote?
I gave her the vote because her SAT scores were pretty even through like critical reading and math, where like with a lot of the other candidates, there was like one of was significantly better than the other. And I feel like having a pretty solid score on both of those shows that like she's pretty well-rounded in academics. She also has a good GPA, and even her joiners, like, you know, she has had consistent involvement. It seems like she's willing to commit to things, and join new things.
You didn't go with, you know, Ashley. You didn't go with Betty. Betty's got a lot of things. She's, you know, Betty's got similar kind of, there's community service, there's a sport, right? Like she's involved in also a breadth of things. Is it just that like her SAT scores were uneven? Like why Cassie and not Betty?
I did do Betty. I did Cassie and Betty.
Cassie and Betty. Never mind. Bad example. Miguel, can I ask you to like nominate someone in room 146 to like make the case for Ed? Oh, I can't hear you if you're talking. One, 4, 6?
they're coming, they gotta unmute.
You'll get there. I believe in you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right, this is Chloe. And
Hi,
so
Chloe.
we were having a problem between choosing Frank or Ed. We definitely chose Betty. So I wanted Ed because Ed seems more committed to like community service. He's a Boy Scout, that means he has morals. He's been doing 4 years of piano and jazz. That's commitment more than Frank. Frank did 3 weeks of math club, and he's on the school disciplinary board. That means like his teachers value him and like he's like a good member of the community. So, and he teaches little kids science. Like, I just think Ed is more well-rounded and seems more suitable. Like Frank just has math team and he gave up on violin, which kind of like turned me off to him coming to Thoreau. So that's my argument for Ed. That's my argument.
Carly, can I get you to weigh back in here? Because Chloe makes an interesting point about Ed, right? Like Boy Scout, music, wrestling, disciplinary board, volunteering, right? He's like similarly well-rounded, but seems to have a little more leadership than Cassie does, stronger grades than Cassie does. Why Cassie and not Ed?
Again, I mean, I don't know exactly. I'm still going with like the more even like SAT scores across the board because I feel like that still demonstrates like even though she has slightly lower grades, she has a better grasp on the math section than Ed does, which might translate more into her classes. Like if Ed struggled a little bit, not really struggled, 670 is really good score, but compared to a 750, there's a big difference in those scores. And also,
I was just gonna say, the thing is, Ed has like a higher overall like GPA. Like he could have had a bad math day. I'm just saying.
And Cassie seems like she's the kind of person who wants to get involved with things, but doesn't necessarily want to take on a leadership, but is very willing to be a participant in things, which I think is just as important as leadership roles.
Yeah, if everybody's a leader, no one's actually getting anything done.
Exactly.
And I don't know if you saw the comments in the chat. I feel like the presentation of some of the interests are unbalanced. 2 summer service trips could have been 2 months each, but the presentation of it does not specify the depth of the commitment.
Yeah, that's right. You have a very short amount of time in an admissions committee and a ton of information that you have to present as the admissions officer in order to move through and make decisions. So presentations get unbalanced, and there's a lot that goes into it that's about the individual person who read it, what they pulled out, how they used it. And so like part of what you're supposed to take out of this is that like you are placing a lot of trust in the person who read the application and then wrote the summary, that they are in fact representing what they saw accurately, holistically, fairly, because you have to put that trust in them. Like you can't in the committee open up every file and like look at everyone's resume and read everyone's essays. Like you have to go by what you're hearing. And so your best judgment about like what that means is what you use. That doesn't mean you can't disagree, right? Like if it turns out that when we start talking about Ashley's, essays, that she's talking about community service and like going to places long enough to like really embed herself in the community, then you can start to come back and be like, when you talked about 2 summer service trips, I don't think that was a fair representation of what's going on. So it's not to say you can't argue with what the admissions officer who wrote the review said, but their synthesis is all you have at this point in time. So, Leonardo, I think you bring up a really tremendous point, and that that lack of fairness and that human element is what makes the admissions process work, and also what makes it fraught and difficult.
Grace wanted to talk about Frank.
Grace, go ahead, make a case for Frank.
Okay, so as someone from that same group who was Team Frank over Ed, I just felt like they had pretty comparable like extracurricular activities. Like I feel like Frank even did better, like being on the math team and the fact that they won last year or this year. I feel like that means that like he's really is good at it as a team player. And then I feel like his grades just kind of speak for themselves, like they're significantly better than Ed's. And so that was why I was Team Frank.
Cool, thank you. We're gonna move on and we're gonna present everything else. So I'm going to show you like what high school they went to, what they want to study. I'm going to talk about what they wrote about in their essays, what their counselors and teachers said. And I'm going to do this. This is probably the part of the presentation that is the most authentic to the committee experience that I had, where like these write-ups are extremely close to the kinds of write-ups that we actually would have heard sitting around the table in admissions. And so I want you to do the best you can to remember all this. And to take that and add it to what the admissions officer has to say about all these other much more qualitative, much less factual pieces, right? There is some commentary that's happening on the extracurricular slides, but mostly it's factual representation. That stops being the case as we move into everything else here. So we're going to start with David. David is an American. His mom is a teacher. His dad's a doctor. He attends a small Quaker school in Maryland. His academic interests are philosophy and physics. The admissions officer who read this application says his essays are all over the place, veering from the formation of consciousness to Richard Nixon. The essay covers so much ground and so many topics, it's a bit hard to follow, but it gives the sense he does a lot of reading outside of class. His government teacher calls him a talkative student who's often the first to voice a dissenting opinion, prefers assignments that make him think over ones that keep him busy. Counselor mentions, quote, tremendous social growth, also lists activities previously unmentioned. David is from a Jewish family background, but attends a Sunday Quaker youth group. He built an app that the school used for its student government elections, and he tried to start a radio production club, but was unsuccessful. So this is David. I think what you start hearing here starts to connect and make sense with some of the things that are back here, right? Like prefers assignments that make him think over ones that make him busy, gives like a little context and a little flavor for why his GPA is lower than everybody else's. I did this presentation once in Singapore, and I had a dad in the front row raise his hand and go, he sounds like a pain in the ass. And I was like, yes, he does. He does sound like a pain in the ass. That is accurate. But, you know, sometimes communities can kind of use a pain in the ass, and that's what the teachers are talking about, right? He voices dissenting opinions. He's not afraid to stir a pot. And that's both good and bad, depending on your point of view and depending on what you think, right? So, you know, to Leonardo's point about like, could be unbalanced presentation. His essays are all over the place, veering from the formation of consciousness to Richard Nixon, depending on who read that essay, right? Like I could imagine reading that essay and going, God, look at how many things he's like trying to squeeze into this one place. It's like a little stream of consciousness, but interesting, right? So you have room to flex a little on how much trust you put in the write-up, but also you don't get to read the essay. This is what you have to work with, and you have to be able to make a decision based on it, yes or no. So that's David. Now we go on to talking about Cassie. Cassie is also American. She attends a suburban high school in an affluent Houston suburb. Her academic interests are chemistry. She wants to be a veterinarian. Supplemental essay talks about her love of animals and how much she fought with her parents to get a dog. Her personal statement is about a service trip to New Orleans. It's mostly description, reads a bit like a book report, but the writing doesn't have problems. Her chemistry teacher calls her reserved, but says she'll ask great questions after class. It's not surprising then when her counselor calls her somewhat shy, but adds that it's amazing how much Cassie has come out of her shell since her 9th grade year. So again, there's some things here that like help you understand prior pieces of information. Like somewhat shy background player is like kind of consistent with what you're seeing in the joiner's profile, but it also may give you a different way to understand performing as an ensemble cast member in a musical. When you just see 1 year of ensemble cast, that may not feel important in the extracurriculars. When you add it to what you're hearing in the recommendations, now all of a sudden this is different meaning in terms of understanding Cassie's growth. Betty. Betty is Japanese. She attends an international school in Japan, but her parents speak very limited English, and so Betty translates for them at school meetings. Her academic interests are women's studies. An international school, if you're not familiar, is basically an American curriculum high school in Japan. Her academic interests are women's studies and Asian studies. Her supplemental essay strives to link interests in literature with gender activism. She says, I want to write to change minds and to elevate my own. Her personal statement dissects the role of women in Japanese society. She rails against traditional society for sticking to old ideas when people in need require innovation and change. One teacher calls her analytical and confident, quote, an original thinker with strong personal convictions, end quote. Counselor calls her unstoppable. She seeks joy and adventure, but is so ambitious. Her grades are messy Cassie's since last year because of a bad breakup with her boyfriend and her family disarray after her grandmother suffered a massive brain hemorrhage. A note from the counselor says to expect a pair of C's on the mid-years. So mid-years are the grades that we get that are the halfway point for senior year. I already told you your most recent grades are your most important grades. Thoreau really doesn't admit students who have multiple C's in their senior year, unless of course we do, because that's for you to decide, but it would be very unusual for a place like Thoreau to do that. A little more context on the international school. Almost everyone at Betty's school is not Japanese. Her teachers are mostly international or American. So her high school is basically like yours, except that she is Japanese in that school and the school is in Japan. There's also a really good comment about the use of the word shy. Leonardo, again, pushing the conversation forward. I love it. One of the things to note, right, is like this is a public high school that Cassie's coming from, where her guidance counselor probably doesn't know her that well because she's one of 300 students in this guidance counselor's caseload. So, you know, you're not going to see the same kind of like powerful, potent, relationship-driven recommendations out of most public schools that you would see out of private schools or international schools like the one Betty goes to. All of this is stuff you have to be aware of and factor in to how you interpret who they are. Ed. Ed is American. He lives in San Francisco, attends a public science magnet school. His academic interests are environmental studies and physics. He writes his personal statement about his passion for alternative energy. He grew up in the cornfields of the American Midwest and wants to be a part of the energy revolution there. Quote, what could be more exciting than a solar field or ethanol production or forests of wind farms, end quote. Supplemental essay is about his unplanned, much younger sister. It's funny, and Ed says that learning to change diapers taught him how to be flexible and embrace the unexpected. His English teacher raves about his use of science in interpreting literature. His excitement to learn is obvious. Ed is still maturing, but he's impossible not to like. Everyone wants to work with him. Counselor says that he was a contender. Ed was a contender for the Most Improved Senior Award. Teachers adore him. He's just the nicest guy. Ed loves what he does rather than joining activities in order to build his resume. So that's Ed. Mostly remote learning. That is a great question. Liam's asking a really good question about how schools will rethink academics based on 11th grade learning being mostly remote. I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure colleges know the answer to this yet because they haven't seen it. And they have some experience from dealing with this past year's senior class, but their circumstances were very different from yours. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I don't know, is the answer.
I'll answer it in the chat.
Cool, thanks. Ashley is an Indian citizen, but attends school also in the Houston suburbs. Dad works for an oil company, which is why they live in Houston now. Her academic interests are biology and Spanish. She wants to be a doctor. She's pre-med. Personal essay is a summary regarding a one-week service project in India and how sad it was to see so much poverty. Conversational tone, but the message is common. Quote, volunteering has since become a part of my life. Supplemental essay about being surrounded by people from all over the world. She appreciates diversity. Teacher calls her conscientious and meticulous. Counselor leans on words like tenacity, says she has a, quote, solid high school career, and adds that Ashley will win the Spanish Department Prize for language ability and is expected to score a 5 on the Spanish AP test. So that's, I think, interesting. Also, you know, Ashley being international and coming from India, it's totally possible that she speaks at least one South Asian language fluently. And so we may be talking about a student here who's not just bilingual, but perhaps trilingual as well. Frank is Singaporean and he attends a local school in Singapore. Dad is a dock worker, mom is a bookkeeper. A bookkeeper in this context is basically someone without a college degree who does accounting work, which means that Frank will be the first person in his family to attend university. His academic interests are economics and chemistry. His coursework is quantitatively focused. His personal statement focuses on meritocracy, which is like the most Singaporean topic you could ever write, and his parents and how his parents pushed him to earn higher grades because hard work and education should be the top priority. Supplemental essay is stylistically bland, but his topic, how economics gives you a way to appreciate human action, is an interesting one. Teachers call Frank a well-mannered hard worker. He always pushes himself. Frank is focused on grades more than ideas. That's from his teacher. Counselor Rex says, Frank's school represents the top group of Singaporean students. Even in that cohort, Frank performs amongst the top of his class in one of the toughest curriculum. So that is Frank. First gen to college, hard worker, in a really, really challenging school environment, getting strong grades and strong scores. So let's go back through. David, the American philosophy physicist, pain in the butt, talkative, social growth. Cassie, quiet, reserved, growing, trying things, joiner, well-rounded academics. Betty, Japanese and international school, interested in women's studies, social issues, Tibetan women's groups, unstoppable until this past year when social and life circumstances have put up a major roadblock for her. And so we're seeing much weaker grades in the first half of her senior year. Ed, American, he was the one with the weaker math score, better writing, environmental studies and physics. People like him, likes to learn, does things because he loves them rather than trying to pad his resume, the nicest guy. Ashley, Indian, bilingual, maybe trilingual, wants to be pre-med, conscious and meticulous, solid high school career, kind of bland essays about volunteerism. And Frank, who we just talked about. So let's have a little bit of a discussion. Who do you want to talk about? If someone who wants to talk can just like put in the chat who you want to talk about, and I'll call your name and you can unmute your mic and discuss who you want to discuss. You don't have to vote yet, but who do you want to talk about? And if
Can we talk about Cassie again?
Yeah, let's talk about Cassie again. Who's this? Who's doing the talking?
Carly again.
Carly again. Give me the fastest version of what you want to say about Cassie so that we can let some other people talk as well.
Oh, basically, I still think that she would be a good fit for the school because, like I said before, like you can't just have super strong leaders all the time. You need some people who are more reserved, but also would, she might be able to come out of her shell even more in college and grow into herself as a person at Aura.
Terrific, thanks. Anya, can you tell us a little bit about what do you want to say about Betty?
Sure. If it's a little like noisy, it's because I'm outside, like running an errand. But I think like what you said is that Thoreau, our hypothetical school, it wouldn't normally admit someone with multiple C's, but I think it's important to acknowledge that there's like extenuating circumstances that create like a very difficult time in someone's life, as well as the fact that like she's a very strong student and would like pose to be like a very capable student, and like we've seen that she is a leader and like is involved. So like I think the idea of 2 C's compared to all of her other achievements and like what who she is as a person, like what she wants to pursue, shouldn't be like, I don't think the C should be weighed above everything else.
And you signaled you wanted to talk about Betty and Ed and Mulvaney. Can I get you to weigh in on Betty? Do you agree with Anya?
Yeah, I agree. I was just thinking that, like, sorry, I'm also outside. Like, she is more than her grades. Like, her personal life is just affecting her academic life. But if those didn't happen, then maybe she wouldn't have the C's.
I'm going to make the counter argument. I'm not sure I believe my own counter argument, but it's the argument that would be made in committee, and so I'll make it here. The breakup with her boyfriend happened last year as a junior, and happened after her grandmother suffered a massive brain hemorrhage. So both of those things are big deals and can explain lower grades, but they must have happened in, April,
Sorry,
May.
don't ask me. Don't ask me.
No, it's fine. They must have happened in like April, May, June, right? And so, like, are we worried that here we are in December of the next year and her grades still haven't rebounded, that she's like still struggling? The classes at Thoreau are not going to be easier than the classes at her current school. Like, is she set up for success at a place like Thoreau if she's barely above water right now where she is? It's an actual question. Somebody can please answer in the positive or the affirmative, or positive or the negative.
I can try to answer that. I'm not sure if it's going to be the best answer, but I'll try my best. So I would say that when there's like life-altering events, like I guess grandmother having a brain hemorrhage is probably a lot more influential than a boyfriend breakup. Depends on how long the boyfriend was, but that's besides.
Yeah.
And I would say that after kind of life-altering events, people can kind of reassess what is important to them. And so in terms of Betty's extracurriculars, she had so many in her original second piece. So she could be investing in herself more in those things that matter in her personal life rather than focusing on her grades. And I think that is actually more important, at least for me, in a student would be. So
I love it. Can I get someone in room 1-4? That's a great comment, Carolyn. There's not a limit on grief. Can I get someone in room 146 to come up and talk about Ed?
So I guess like her main issue is like Ed versus Frank, but more leaning towards Ed. Because while Ed might not have like the biggest grades, he's more of like an idealistic person, which like explains why he doesn't focus on grades that much.
That's great. Ed's grades are pretty damn good.
Well, like it's SATs, yeah, but yeah, it's like he has pretty good grades. Not like Ashley or Frank, but it's because like he's more of an idealistic person. He focuses on like extracurriculars and like really focus on like science. So it's like a really good case. Like at least consider Ed to be one of the two, if not Betty and Frank.
Thank you. I'm gonna make we're getting close to when I have to leave, so no one is asked to talk about Frank. I'm gonna make the appeal for Frank, and I want to remind everybody that like the goal in this discussion is not to win the argument. The goal is to make the best decision for Thoreau. So it's totally reasonable to change your mind, or to if somebody points out something where you're like, "Ooh, I didn't think about it that way." That's like part of the reason the committee convenes and talks about this, is so that you can remember things that are hard to remember because there are so many factors that are going into this. So I'm going to try to make the case for Frank, and then I'm going to ask you to vote. So Frank is a product of his environment. Like here he is in this hyper meritocratic culture, in a school culture that values hard work, and that values grades more than ideas. He's in a local school. He comes from a first generation background where there is probably tremendous pressure on him to achieve things socially and economically that his parents could not. And what we're seeing in his essays and what we're seeing in his recommendations is that like Frank is making these decisions and performing in the way that people around him expect him to perform, and he is doing the absolute best you could ask him to do. And so when we see things in his extracurriculars, like, you know, that he stopped playing violin when he got to his junior year in Singapore is like the monster year. It's totally reasonable that his parents were the ones who were like, you can't keep playing violin. We need you to sit down and focus on the grades. I wouldn't expect any of you to know this about Singapore necessarily unless you spent a lot of time there, but I used to recruit there. And this is a really common thing that you see this huge drop off in extracurriculars when students get to 11, a drop off that the schools and the parents are asking students to make. And so my appeal on behalf of Frank is like, if we don't admit Frank, then who's the first generation Singaporean that we're willing to admit ever? Because I don't know it's reasonable to expect more from an applicant with his background than what he's doing. So that's my case for Frank. Normally I would be like, let's all have a conversation about that too, but we're running short on time and I want to make sure I can show you what happened. So take a moment now, put into the chat your round 3 votes, and then we'll move into the final part of this, where I show you their final end results. Add them in. David, Cassie, Betty, Ed, Frank. Betty and Ed, Frank and Ed, Frank and Ed, Frank and Betty, Frank and Betty, Frank and Betty, Betty and Frank. This is a pretty good, it looks like Frank's winning. And there's kind of a spread between Betty and Ed, Frank and Cassie. Yeah, Carly, stick with Cassie. Miss Williams, Frank and Ashley. Ashley, iconoclastic choice. I assume you want to see what happened, the actual decisions. If everyone could unmute your microphones while I present the actual decisions, you can all react together. I'm half serious. So here are the actual decisions. And by actual decisions, I mean fake decisions because none of these people exist and Thoreau doesn't exist either. But here's what happened. David was denied. None of you voted for David, which sucks because David is based on me. I'm David. Thank you. All the worst. You're all the worst. I'm a Jew who went to a Quaker school in Maryland and liked philosophy and physics. You all suck. Cassie was denied. Betty was waitlisted.
Betty.
Ed was admitted. Ashley was denied. Frank was admitted.
Frank.
So real quick, final takeaways. For the thing I always find really interesting is like I get to the end of this and I present the actual fake decisions and you all are so invested in what happens to them and they don't even exist. Like the school doesn't exist, the people don't exist, none of this is real. And yet like you cared about the outcomes in a way that I think is like bizarre, but also like reflective of the actual experience of being a real admissions officer where you get invested in these people who you don't know and whose decisions like impact them. And like if you loved them, if you were like a massive Betty supporter and you went into that committee and fought really hard for her and she still got waitlisted, like you can't just like email her and be like, Betty, listen, I know the rest of the committee didn't agree, but I loved you. And there's a set of things that are happening here behind the scenes that you just like don't have access to. And one of the other things I want you to see, or the two other things I want you to see is who's in the room matters a lot. Like I don't know. I mean, I expect some of you changed your vote based on the pitch I made for Frank because I pointed things out you couldn't see until I said it. And the same thing happens in an actual admissions committee. Like one person makes one comment about an application they didn't even read, and now the whole room swings in a different direction because the person who made that comment was like talking about something real that got unnoticed. And so, you know, and the same thing for like Betty and Ed, right? Like in our room, Betty, I think, beats Ed. In other rooms, Ed beats Betty. So like who they are matters, what they put in their application matters, but who's in the room connecting with it also matters, and you don't control that. There's like a level of arbitrariness to the decisions that are being made, even though each of us as individuals have a huge amount of intention and are being very deliberate in who we choose to vote for. And so even though each of us are deliberate, the process as a whole ends up having a component to it that is arbitrary and unpredictable. And the other thing I want to point out is that there is not one path to getting in. Like Frank gets in because his background and his context helps us understand who he is. Betty gets your vote and gets in because she does these impressive things and talks about these impressive things in her application. And those things are specific: women's rights, social issues. Ed gets in because you just like him. He's just likable. There's like not one thing about Ed's application that makes you go, that's an admit. It's the way the pieces come together. And the other thing is like, on the opposite end of that, for Cassie, I don't think she did anything wrong. She's well-rounded. She's involved in a ton of different things. She's solid all around academically. What she wants to study lines up with what she's good at. And yet there was a single person who voted for her. Because when you're talking about selective admissions, there is a big difference between doing things right and doing nothing wrong. Talking about what you love and what's impressive and important to you allows you to establish a connection with the people who read your application that Cassie didn't get to for most of us, not because there was something missing or she did something wrong, but because there were just others we liked more who were in the pool. So I have to run now unceremoniously. I apologize for that. You're welcome to reach me at this email address if you have specific questions, but I'm also going to turn over like the debrief to your extraordinarily capable counselors. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate. I hope this was fun and interesting for you, even though it was over Zoom. I love you all. I love you, Berkeley Carroll. I'm so glad you let me do this. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. All right. Well, what did you think? What did you glean from that? I was just saying to Ms. Milton and Mr. Almonte, like when I worked in college admissions, I always just wanted to admit everybody because that's me. But of course you can't always do that. Did this change the way you think about the college admission process? Yeah, Leah.
I don't know. I became a lot more invested in who these people are, and I really wanted to see them succeed. And I'm going to be honest, at first I was a little concerned because I didn't really know what was happening behind the scenes. Like, for all I knew, that there were just like, I don't know, 15 people who were all just like, okay, maybe this person, maybe that person, whatever. But like, to actually be invested in someone who doesn't even exist shows that the people who are doing this job actually care about who are going to schools, and they really do want the best for you. And I think that that's definitely more comforting than it was before.
Yeah, I mean, I think we say, I mean, I hope we say this to you all, but when I talk to admissions reps, they're not looking to deny students. They're actually trying to find ways to admit students. It's just sort of that the difficulty in you may have 30,000 applications, but you only have 2,000 spots, right? And I think one of the things we've seen in the last year is this pretty big increase in applications, but schools aren't getting bigger. Their classes are staying the same size. Anya?
Yeah, it was definitely like really interesting and definitely helpful, but it was also a little anxiety inducing. I mean, for me, because I'm an anxious person in general, but like hearing that you could technically do nothing wrong, but doing nothing wrong just doesn't hit home with the people in the room. Like that's a little worrisome. Like it's a little scary, but like, I mean, obviously you'll like connect with certain people, but like knowing that you as a person or like your application could just not connect with a group of people is like a little worrisome for me. I don't know.
Can I add on to Anya before you go into it? Because I was gonna say like, oh, this is Chloe.
Oh, hi, Chloe.
Hi, Miss Williams. Yeah, like the first thing I said, we were muted, so like you can hear me. But I was like, I feel like that just made it a lot scarier, less than it was like comforting. Like now I understand like how the process is going. But, like to be reduced to like 3 sentences is really like, I don't want to say but like it just feels like really like, I don't know, it's anxiety. It's anxiety. That it comes down to like all the time.
Go ahead, Luke.
One thing that I would say is like, you have to understand that by the time your application gets to committee, which is what we just did, your application has been read thoroughly by the first reader. So every college or university has a admissions counselor that's assigned to Berkeley Carroll, and that person thoroughly reads your application and sets the tone for it. And then your application could be read maybe 2, 3, 4 more times before it actually ends up becoming a discussion. So it's a very in-depth process. And really understanding like how invested all of you were, like Leo was saying, the admissions counselors are just like that, and they are very much in contact with you, right? So never underestimate the power of doing an optional interview or having the opportunity to email a admissions representative. And I tell my students all the time, hey, email these people, introduce yourself, start a conversation about what you like about the school, and you can't imagine how far that can take you sometimes. So it's a scary process, but at the same time, you also have to have confidence in yourself. All of you you're working with your college counselors to highlight the really great things about yourself, what you're doing academically, what you're doing extracurricularly, your personality. It's really a thorough process that we put forward for you. And what Ms. Middleton said in the chat is you're not applying to just one college. So the stakes aren't so high that if you don't get into this one school, it's over for you and like you have to wait until the next year. That's really why we promote having a list that, is on average, or I would say like 9 to 12 schools. And ideally that's balanced, because you just never know how admissions is going to go out at any school. But if every school on your list is a school that you like and a school that you can see yourself being happy at, then it takes that scariness away from the process, as maybe you reach a little higher for something that might be within your academic profile or a little outside of it.
And I would just add, I mean, if you think about, I don't think about it as reducing students to 3 sentences, but really getting to highlight the most important things that you've done over the last few years. You know, Chloe, when you were talking about Ed, it was funny because one, I could hear your bias a little bit. So like you clearly connected with the jazz musician. Frank dropped music and you were like, what do you mean you dropped music? But that's sort of why we have more than one reader, because someone else can say, but wait a minute, you know, Frank dropped music, like Dan said, because this is something that he was being asked to do by his counselors and his parents in order to focus on some other things that might creep up. So you're never reduced to a few sentences. And yes, I mean, I think by the time you know, students come to committee, they've been read so many times, your admission rep knows you pretty well. And again, just to speak to connecting, you know, when I was in admissions, I once added a school visit that was maybe an hour outside of the city I was visiting for to do my regular visits, because a student came to visit the campus over the summer and he was so excited and so invested in the school. I was like, this is a student that I want to invest time in. And so I made that trek because I could, but also because, you know, I knew that there was someone who was interested in us and I wanted to reinforce that we were also interested in that student. So you can actually make connections. I am still connected to students I admitted to college 15 years ago. You can make those connections with your admissions reps. You just have to be diligent about it and thoughtful about it. So you're not being reduced to one line. And like you said, like Leah said, you could tell you were already invested in these applicants, even though they don't exist. Although I knew David was Dan.
Can I add one thing, Ms. Williams?
Oh, of course.
Ms. Williams, Mr. Almonte, and I all used to lead case study discussions like this at the universities and colleges where we worked. So we would travel around the country and address a group of students or a group of parents with fictitious case studies. They're never as good as a real application. Because just like, you know, if you're reading a story about someone, you can't get a real story out of a fake application. You can get a real story out of a real application. And I constantly am using the word collage when I talk about the application, because there's so many different kind of parts and pieces that come together, you know, voices that you won't know what they've said. You know, you won't read your college counselor letter or your teacher letters before they're said. So it doesn't all rest only on your shoulders to get that story out there and make it a cohesive story. I always look at case studies that I've seen and say, our applicants are so much better, because their stories are real.
And
so if that helps it.
And our team goes above and beyond. You know, like if there really is something that we're invested in, and you know, we're invested in all of you, like because we want to, but also because it's our job. But it's a mix of those things. We build a relationship with all of you, and we understand you as a person. Myself, Miss Williams, and Miss Middleton, at some point or another, depending on the situation, has sometimes the admissions counselor will call us, or other times we'll call them, or we'll reach out and say like, hey, can I have a conversation with you? If context needs to be provided. This isn't anything that's going to happen to every student, but like extenuating circumstances that need to be understood. You aren't just going to be a couple lines on a page or just a letter. Sometimes it is a conversation. And we do this in different ways with connecting with admissions counselors that we have relationships with over the years. And sometimes it is an offhand conversation to just say like, hey, could you just give me 5 minutes so I can explain something to you that, you know, I want to do justice to that was in my letter. So it is a very convoluted process. It's very dynamic, but there's a lot of moving parts in it as well too.
One other thing I would add is that, you know, there are humans on the other side of this application process. So you're not like sending your application to a computer that's gonna, I don't know, code something and say yes or no. It's actual people like Dan, like me, like Mr. Almonte and Ms. Middleton. And you are going to get to spend time with those people who are reading your applications in the fall. We've already started to lay that groundwork for you by having colleges visit this spring. And so if there are schools that we've invited to visit Berkeley Carroll in the next, I think, do we have any more visits left, or are they all scheduled? We have a few more. Oh, Ms. Dunn, you're muted.
All right, we definitely have the Penn State University coming next Tuesday, and I think that's it for the rest of the season.
And then next fall, starting in September, we're going to have over 100 college reps come through Berkeley Carroll. They'll most likely do it virtually over Zoom, but you will actually get to be face-to-face with them to some extent in the fall. And that's a chance for you to introduce yourself, to learn about the school, but also show them a little bit about who you are. One thing that we're always really proud of is that our students ask the best questions. And we constantly hear from reps, Berkeley Carroll students, your questions are so good, they make them think. And they carry that into the committee room. So when like little Jamie Leslie from Oak Park, Illinois was like not the strongest applicant in the room, I carried that school visit with me because I remembered. And now his parents buy me pancakes every time I go to Chicago. It's great. It all works out. You'll all be fine. Notice how everybody in the class of 2021 who wanted to go to college had many choices and is going off to school next fall. You will be in the same position this time next year. All right, well, we don't want to keep you past the time we said. We know you've had a long Zoom day. Some of you are still in the building and probably want to get home. But if you have questions, you know, you can always reach out to us. You know how to schedule an appointment with your college counselor. And we will send more information about the debrief paragraph that we want you to think about and reflect a little bit on what you experienced. It may help you sort out maybe some of the confusing feelings you have about this experience, or maybe you feel more comforted by it. But thank you all for being so attentive. It was good to see some of your faces. It would have been nice to see all of your faces.
Thank you, everyone.
I'm still here, Weezy.
Thank you so much. Hey, folks, can you wait around 1 second? 1 second. Thank you. All right.
Hey, Weezy, what's up?
I just had one question about, sorry if you can hear like the buzzing outside, but I've heard of this, I don't remember what it's called, but they're like letters you can send after acceptance has already come out to a school to like beg them to let you in. And I was wondering like how much influence those letters have in like terms of like acceptance and changing like, I don't know, acceptance status.
Yeah, so that's usually about students who are waitlisted. So if you apply to a school and they want to admit you, but they just don't have the space, they may put you on the wait list. And the letter of continued interest is just to keep telling them, I'm still thinking about you. If you take me off the wait list, you're my first choice. And making that clear sometimes can really help. It just all depends on numbers. So some schools may think, like we may have talked to a school in March and they said, oh yeah, we're probably going to our wait list. And then in May 15th, they might have said, oh, whoops, we're over enrolled, which is what I've heard a lot this year. So we're probably not going to go to our wait list. But that's why we want you to, like Mr. Almonte said, have multiple schools that you're interested in. And that way, when you have your choices next April, you're excited about all of them. Like a wait list option should never be the thing you focus on. I want you to get excited about the schools where like you're actually.
I was just curious because I wanted to put Ed on a wait list, and then if he wrote a letter of continued interest, then I wanted to let him in because then I think he'd be great at so many other schools. Like he's too good. If he wants to really come here, we'll let him in. Okay. Yeah, that was it. Okay.
Wheezy, Ed's not real.
I know.
Just kidding.
Thank you for reminding me. I get too attached sometimes. Okay. All right.
That was great. Thanks, Wheezy.